Welcome to the Branding Room Only podcast, where we share career stories, strategies, and lessons learned on how industry leaders and influencers have built their personal brands. Now, let's get started with the show. Hey, y'all. I'm really excited for you to hear this next conversation that I had with Annette Gordon-Reed. She is a professor. She is an author. She is a Pulitzer Prize winner. And she's fantastic. And she is a scholar on both the experiences of Thomas Jefferson, as well as the Hemingses, who were the enslaved family who were enslaved by Thomas Jefferson, as well as about Juneteenth. And you all know that I have privileged enough to have a lot of people who want to be in conversation with me. And I have been blessed enough to not have to go and ask a lot of people, but I specifically wanted to have this conversation. So I reached out to a good friend of mine who happens to be your husband to ask for him to help me to get this conversation. And I can't wait for you to hear it. It is fantastic. Listen up. Hi, everyone. It's Paula Edgar, your host of Branding Room Only. Very excited for the conversation today. Guess what, y'all? My guest is Professor Annette Gordon-Reed, and she is the Carl M. Loeb University Professor at Harvard University. She is also the Pulitzer Prize and National Book Award-winning author of The Hemingses of Monticello, An American Family, and she's also the author of On Juneteenth. Professor Gordon-Reed, welcome to the Branding Room.
Thank you for having me.
So excited for this conversation. A little bit of background. Your husband, Justice Robert Reed, is one of my favorite people.
Oh, cool.
And so I was very excited to have this connection. And in fact, the first time that I had a chance to even read one of your books was because he recommended something. And he often will send me content about you. He's super proud of you. And so
He's a great publicist.
He really is. He really is. I'm really trying to hire him. So let's get started. I ask everyone on the podcast, what does a personal brand mean to you? How do you define it?
Well, I think it's synonymous almost with the notion of reputation, how people view you as a person and what it is that you're doing in the public sphere. So it's about who I am and what people think of me. And you want people to think well of you. And so that's my brand, is my reputation.
Love that, which is a perfect tee into describe yourself in 3 words or short phrases.
Wow.
That's one.
I'm intense.
Mm-hmm.
I'm quiet, loyal.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I love that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So do you have a favorite quote?
You know, there are lots of to everything, there's a season. The time for every purpose under heaven, Ecclesiastes. I think it's an important thing to keep in mind. It's a difficult thing to keep in mind because you want the good things to go on and on and on. But, time to, rend, the time to sow, that's a favorite quote of mine.
It was also one of my mother's favorite ones. So thank you for reminding me about that and bringing that up. Do you have a hype song, which is essentially when they're going to get full on Professor Annette Gordon-Reed, what song is playing in your head? Or if you're having a bad day, what song are you playing to pick yourself back up? It could be the same song or different ones.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have a number of them. I like, strangely enough, when I'm working on stuff, I like this is old school, Monticello Jordan's This Is How We Do It. Is a good song. Mm-hmm. And, I like the piano. I like to listen to the piano. So there's a particular piece by Chopin, a scherzo in C minor, that I like a lot. And that's instrumental. So there are no words to it. But the hype song, because This Is How We Do It, I've always liked that.
Well, we're going to include both of those in the show notes. So there's okay. So tell me a little bit about how you grew up and how that shaped your brand.
Well, I grew up in a small town in Texas. The town that I was born in had fewer than 3,000 people. And then we moved when I was a baby to a town that had probably fewer than 5,000 people. My mother was a school teacher. My father owned a couple of small businesses, a store, a funeral home at one point. And it was a typical kind of lower, in general, we would be lower middle class people. If for the Black community, we would have been middle class, I guess you could say, not well off, but not really poor either. My mother was an English teacher and was very much interested in education. So, she read to us, and in the summers we had classes for half, in the mornings in the summer, so we wouldn't fall behind. She, I had piano lessons. Sometimes we went to the theater. I know they didn't have a lot of money, so I don't really know how they managed to do all of that, but they did. It was something that was important for us to do. And so it was a house that always had books in them. Both of my parents read and talked about what they read. And we, took newspapers and all those kinds of things. So it was a home where reading was always something that was important, and also music.
Which is a good connection to what you do as an educator now, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's, if my mother were alive, she wouldn't be surprised at all at what I'm doing now, because she sort of, she wasn't consciously training me to do this, but she was certainly the kinds of stuff that she put into, even my father too, and the kinds of discussions we had made me fit for the kind of things that I do now.
Love that. So that's your upbringing. Tell me about your career journey.
Well, I started out practicing law at a law firm on Wall Street. That's not what I went to law school to do. I'm not really sure. I didn't have a plan in mind when I went to law school. I knew I wanted to be a lawyer, but because I knew that lawyers end up in different places. They don't always, they're not always in a courtroom or anything like that. So I started off practicing law. And when I didn't have the time to do the kind of writing that I wanted to do, I switched to academia, and I got a job at New York Law School here in New York City. My requirements were that I had to be in the city because I was married and I had 2 kids, and I couldn't just, pick up and go anywhere. And so I was at New York Law School, supposed to be writing a law review article about prisons, about prisoners' rights. And ended up writing my first book, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy. And to my good fortune, it went well. It was well received, and it became an important book before the DNA testing was done on descendants. The DNA corroborated what I said in my book. And that really set me off on the path to history, because, I wasn't law professors are typically writing law review articles, but I didn't do that, and went on to, write this book that did very, very well. And it was an unconventional journey to a history department, but I got a job at Rutgers Newark in the history department, and I stayed at NYLS. And then I wrote the Hemingses and Monticello, which won a lot of awards, and it changed my life. I mean, the first book changed my life too, but this changed my life in a major, major kind of way. And that's how I ended up at Harvard, because of the response to the book. So it's been people ask me about my trajectory, and I can't say, well, first you do this and then you do that, because that's not what happened with me. This is such a circuitous route to where I am, which I guess is a message too for young people, is that you don't really know where things are going to go, but you have to somehow be prepared to do when opportunities arise, you have to be prepared to take them on. So I don't have a traditional trajectory, but that's it. And so after this, everything sort of unfolded from writing the books. And in the meantime, in between those two things, I did a book with Vernon Jordan. I helped him write his memoirs, which was, not a thing that academics typically do, but I wanted to do it because I knew who he was, and I knew who I would meet with him. And it's true, you become like 1 degree separated from everybody if you know him, because he knew everyone. So that's another mix of the piece of the puzzle that's not standard, but has been really important.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of lessons just in that one little chunk, right? Is to know that it's not a straight line to anywhere anymore.
No.
and to be open to opportunities. But when you just kind of laid that out, what made you even want to write about Thomas Jefferson and the Hemingses at all?
Well, what made me want to write about it is I had been reading about Jefferson and Monticello and slavery
Mhm.
from the time I was young, from childhood as a young person.
Mhm.
And it intrigued me that the way people responded to this story, because I knew that in slavery, slave owners, enslavers had children with enslaved women
Mhm.
all the time. That was not something, but for people to treat it like this was some big deal because it was Jefferson, and treat it in a way that meant that, they would ignore the words of African Americans who had been enslaved, who talked about Monticello and talked about Jefferson, and they would build up the words of his legal white family, even though they were saying things that were not true. Usually when people try to convince you of something by saying things that aren't true, that affects their credibility. But that wasn't happening in history. And so this is Tom and Sally is interesting, but it's not the main thing. Is how do you listen to the words of people who were enslaved? I mean, it seems to me that it's more important to pay attention to their words than to pay attention to sort of burnish the image of the people who were enslaving them. So it was really about the way history is written. And when you're writing about, too, particularly the founding fathers type people, where you make other people's stories lesser in order to build them up. So that's what it was really about. I wanted to show the double standard in seeing evidence. And so that it's not only just about the writing of history, but it's about African American people in general. There was a time when Blacks couldn't testify against whites, right? And, their testimony is weighed less than. And so you still see that process working itself out. So I thought this particular story had a bigger message than just, did Tom and Sally have kids together?
Right. I'm so glad I asked you the question because it's almost like a given, unfortunately, right? That dichotomy exists in so many things where Black voices and Black perspectives are diminished and or not given credibility at all.
Yeah.
And especially in this country, it's the founding fathers, right?
Yeah.
When you think about brands, that is the lore of America is a part of who we are as a people. And so to have that shaken even a little bit feels like, oh, but this is who we are. But it's also, the truth is who we are too.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not just one thing, and it's not just all to the benefit or to the glory of one group of people, and particularly not people who are enslaving folks. I mean, you would think that their stories would be much more suspect because they're the ones who have the reason to lie, to try to make themselves look good. And so that's what really motivated me to write the book.
Wow, that is. Whenever I think of someone kind of stepping into their magic, which is what this sounds like, I'm always like, I read a lot of things and I'm like, someone should do something. And I'm like, who's going to be? But to be able to actually say, I'm going to do this, particularly when you are doing something totally different, right? Doing law.
Yes.
And we had that.
I didn't even tell anybody except my husband that I was writing a book. And so I was working on this thing furiously. And fortunately, this was before I had tenure. And typically you're supposed to be writing, as I said, law review articles to present to people. And it's law in the sense that it's a law professor in the first book looking at evidence, looking at how historians used, and I would say misused evidence. And so I think it has a message for, I talk in the book like I talk to my students about, here's a case, here's one side, here's another side, here's evidence, here's corroborating stuff. So it did have that flavor to it, but it wasn't traditional. And because luckily it was successful, it helped me, it was okay with the school for me to do it because it worked.
And we have that in common because I worked at New York Law School as well back in the day.
Oh, wow.
I didn't really have that connection. We also have a slight Vernon Jordan connection as well. I remember like the last time that I saw him, we were at a conference or like a reception, and we were talking, and I was talking about how I went to boarding school. I went to Deerfield Academy, and he's like, "You got into Deerfield Academy," and I said it because I knew that his grandchild was there, and I was like, "Yes, I'm about to." So it was funny because he was obviously being funny, but he was very charismatic and
Yes, he was very charismatic. Oh,
very,
you
very
went to Deerfield. I went to
did.
Dartmouth, and there were a lot of people from
Oh yes,
Deerfield who came to Dartmouth.
yes, they're both big D's and green,
Yeah,
and
big D's, yeah, D's and green. So yeah, it
yeah,
was sort of a
yeah,
feeder school in some ways.
absolutely is the feeder school. So tell me, because we started talking about the brand piece of this, and in the United States and the American sort of lore, like I was saying, Thomas Jefferson is a big brand. Like I think about, how Hamilton was so successful and how we hear the stories of all of the kind of things of our forefathers. And then you counteract that with some of the hard truths that exist. And I'm a big believer in there's a yes and there's an and, right? Right? There's a lots of value that you bring, and also you're a slave owner. When you think about the personal branding and historical figures and how we kind of really hold on to the lore of it all, do you think that it's helpful for us to understand the story and the truth of the story in terms of shaping actual legacy?
Oh, definitely. It
Mhm.
has to be both of those things. So you don't get the true picture, because then you don't understand, well, why are these particular things happening? I mean, I know we have a story about who we say we are, but then there are all these other problems. Well, if you get the complete picture, then you understand, why some of these problems exist and why they haven't been solved and how intractable they are. So you have to do both of those things. And I know there's a tendency with the founding fathers or whatever to want to, you think it all has to be positive, or
Right.
people aren't going to appreciate the things they did. But you can appreciate the things they did, even as you talk about the things they didn't do and would have been better, because it's about a journey, right? That this country has been on, and we have been on in this country, particularly African American people, from slavery, out of slavery, to Jim Crow, and to still, working towards some notion of the declarations of equality and so forth. But it has to be a realistic picture of these things. It can't just be all, sweetness and light.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yes. And I think about what's happening it's across the country in so many places, including Texas,
Yeah, yeah.
and the right and wanting to have history be less painful and less less harmful to people, even though history is history, like from multiple perspectives, but it's still history. And my family, lives in Florida, and so I have a lot
Oh,
of
wow.
challenge in thinking about, the fact that there's a lot of erasure and well, wanting to have a lot of erasure of the experiences of Black people nationally. All right. So I think this is a good segue
Yes,
to,
yes.
to talking about on Juneteenth and talking about your connection to Juneteenth and the book that you've written on Juneteenth. So you're from Texas, so
Yeah.
you come from the home and the heart of Juneteenth. Can you maybe give a little bit of context for the folks who may not know? But hopefully, at this point, there's not a lot of people because just a little bit
Yeah.
about Juneteenth, and then to talk about why you wrote the book.
Well, Juneteenth is a shortened version of June 19th, 1865, which was the day that the United States Army came to Galveston, Texas, to announce the end of slavery in Texas, and issued General Order Number 3, saying that slavery was over. And it's a day that Black Texans have celebrated since 1865, essentially, since the moment it took place. I mean, the more formal, I think maybe the first formal ones were the following year, but it's the longest continuing, celebration of that, of the holiday. And it doesn't mark the end of slavery in the United States, because that doesn't happen until the 13th Amendment is fully, ratified in 1865 in December, some months later. But I think it's important because it was the end of the military effort to maintain the system of slavery, because the Confederates kept fighting even after Lee surrendered. in April of 1865. They kept fighting. And in Texas, the last battle was in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
They finally surrender in June. And that's when Granger can come in and say, slavery is over here. And it was, a jubilant day for people, even though it was also a dangerous time because people who resented this very often enacted violence to stop people from celebrating. During my researching for the book, I found some instances of people in a town where a couple of dozen people were whipped for celebrating. Can you imagine celebrating the end of slavery? But then the people who own them, because they see that as a loss, and it was a loss to them. So I wrote this book because I'd written a piece. I'd been thinking about Texas because I'd written 2 pieces about Texas in the years immediately before I wrote this one for the New Yorker and one for the New York Review of Books. I did a review of 6 books about Texas. The New Yorker review was in the spring of 2020. And then we had the pandemic.
Yeah, we did.
And, some people got puppies and some people did, started yoga or whatever. I wrote a book. I was here in New York, as was sort of ground zero for all of this. And we weren't doing anything except going out to Central Park and taking a walk and then coming back in and staying. It's just such a surreal moment to even think about this.
Yeah.
And I decided, with the urging of my editor, to write about Juneteenth, to do a short book that would be sort of a history, but also a memoir, which I have never done before. So it was it was the kind of writing I did when I was growing up. I always wanted to be a writer. So I would write short stories and essays and things like that growing up. So it took me back to those days. And it took me back to the Vernon Jordan thing, except now I'm writing about my life instead of, helping him write about his. So my editor says this in June, right after the holiday. He says, we can do this if you could deliver me something by September. So
wow,
that's what I did. And I delivered the book in September in time for the following Juneteenth. And it was good. It was interesting. I mean, I neither of my parents are alive, and I found myself thinking about them when you're thinking about mortality and you're thinking in the middle of a pandemic.
Yeah.
And I missed them, and I thought one of the good things about the book is that if I could talk about them and our lives together, that would sort of bring them back in a way. And so it was emotionally satisfying to me and intellectually satisfying to me. And it was fun to do, to remember growing up in the 70s, being, a kid in the 70s, what that was like in Texas. And so, and the book came out in May, and then the president, a couple of months later, a month later, I guess, signed the bill. And I was invited to go to the White House to witness that. And it was a wonderful moment.
It must have been surreal.
Yeah.
It must have been. I mean, even hearing about it, because, again, you put yourself in the right line of place and opportunities happen. But I'm sure that having your book at that time was not a bad thing. You weren't regretting having a book at that time when
no, not at all.
National holiday.
My editor, Bob Weil, is a genius. He's a great editor, but he's also savvy. And so he was the one who said, who insisted, don't put this off. Let's just do this year, and get me something by September, something short. And something that, and that's worked out really, really well. It's kind of hard to write short in some ways,
especially by yourself. With your story,
yeah. But I mean, it did, as I said, resemble the kind of writing that I was doing when I was younger, and not like the books, not like the history books, but I enjoyed myself doing it.
Yeah, it's your history book.
Yeah.
When I was thinking about, all of the people who are my listeners and who watch on YouTube know I love wearing bright colors, and I always wear red glasses, but I deliberately was like, I have to wear red today because we were talking about Juneteenth. And so I would love if you would like, share about like how it is celebrated. What are some of the traditions that go into celebrating Juneteenth?
Well, the traditions that I grew up with were, it's a community holiday. So you can do one or two things. I mean, people sometimes go to a park. If they're in cities, there are public parks, there's commemorations of them. And when I grew up, it was basically a community celebration. So you would, my grandmother and, grandmothers and mothers all around, people and grandfathers would barbecue. Barbecue goat is a part of the menu. We didn't eat goat, but that's something that was a part of it. And you're supposed to have some kind of red drink. And someone pointed this out to me. I hadn't thought about this that much, but usually it was hibiscus. They thought it started out as hibiscus tea, not Big Red or what we have now is red soda water, as we called it. But it's a sort of people think it's a West African tradition because in the West Indies, there's sorrel. I mean, in every place has a red drink that somehow gets figured into all of this. So the roots of this are apparently, predate the New World, essentially, that people think that this is something that comes from Africa. So having red things is important. And we, firecrackers, I can't believe our parents let us have our grandparents, my grandfather bought us firecrackers and say, now be careful, like we have kids now. I can't imagine doing that. But
come back with that arm. Come
back with your arm, come back with your finger, come back with your hand. It's just the parenting in those days was really, really different than it is now. I don't know if it's better or worse, but firecrackers, too much soda water, barbecue goat. And in my family, because we were in Texas, my grandmother had gotten a recipe for tamales. And so she made tamales, and tamales are a holiday food. So people would order like dozens of them from her, and she would make them. She was selling tamales to raise money for the St. Luke's United Methodist Church to build a new church. And so that was also a part of it. So you see the Texas connection there. There's the soul food kind of stuff. You would have that typical fare, but there was also tamales would be a part of it.
I love that kind of mix of culture that happens wherever you bring in new people.
Exactly. People talk about food appropriation, but people do that. That's what people do. That's what food is. It's already coming from, when there was Katrina and a lot of people from New Orleans moved to Houston. Then we started seeing stuff that I had never seen. Crawfish boils. Crawfish. Now, I knew that there were crawfish. A restaurant might occasionally have something like that, but that was not. But now I ride around Texas now and I see signs. I mean, it's for barbecue, crawfish boils. I'm like, what? Where does it come from? But that's the influence of all these people who moved into that area. And so we now have another culinary part of East Texas.
I love that. I don't know if you've seen the Netflix documentary Higher in the Hog. Have you had a chance to see that?
No, but I know about it.
Yeah, they talk about Juneteenth and celebration and food. And there was one person who spoke who talked about there's not really, so your point of thing is food appropriation because everybody has access to food, but there is food appreciation. And it's important not to forget where these traditions and where these things.
Exactly. No, so as long as you're not claiming that you discovered this,
exactly.
But it's appreciated. Everybody brings all this together and it's greater. Some of the parts are, make this whole really good.
It's true. My family's from Barbados and Jamaica, and I just got back from both of the places actually for spring break recently. And when you said goat, I was like, goat. And obviously sorrel is a big part of our tradition as well. And I love that is a continuation of our African roots. So tell me what you think about Juneteenth and its importance in the context of American history. And it's good and it's bad.
Well, the good part of it, the bad part of it, let's start with that, is potentially that it becomes rote. It becomes like, a day for a mattress sales and stuff like that. And you don't really think about the importance of it. I think also I gather that there is some small degree of resentment on the part of some people who say, well, we have our days too. In Virginia, it's April. I mean, emancipation was a process. It wasn't just one thing that happened one day and then everything was okay. It was a process. So, but what I'm hoping is that Juneteenth can be like an umbrella for that you talk about the fact that as the Army of the United States kind of rolled across the country and as African-American people themselves left plantations, that emancipation was a process. And this is an occasion for us to stop and think about that. So I think that's a good part about it. And the day asks you to think about history, which is, I think, always an important thing. It's a way of connecting us to the people who came before us, and you remember the struggles that they had. I mean, one of the things that I really like, that one of the facts that I learned in writing the book was the 5 men in Houston, Texas, former enslaved people who pooled their resources, pooled their money, saved their money, and bought land in Houston for a commemoration of Juneteenth. So they would have a place to come and note the day, which I think is an amazing, extraordinary thing, because what it means is that they sort of assumed that generations to come would remember that day and wanted them to have a place to do it. So that's it's an amazing connection between the past and, their present, but also their future. They're thinking about how, and so it just took it for granted that their descendants would remember this. And so I think that's a very powerful thing for people. And so any day that you can think about history, think about family. Yeah. I mean, I encourage people and one of the things they might do is to have young people in their families take a family history on Juneteenth, an occasion to talk to your grandparents and your great-grandparents, anybody who's living, about what their lives were like. Right. That's an important thing to do. So, I think there's so much positive that can come out of it.
I love that as a thing because I shouldn't say we, because I don't do this, but a lot of people see the person right in the time they are now and forget that they have a story, right? Everybody has a story. And with our families, we just get auntie, but we don't think when auntie, what she did when she was younger.
Yeah.
And that is something that can be done across racial boundaries like that.
No, it's not just Black people. Everybody can do that. Everybody should do it. We're going to have some interesting stories about the pandemic. I still don't think we've come to grips with what happened to us, because it seems so bizarre that, for this period of time, the whole world pretty much almost came to a halt in a sense. And it's still affecting us, but, it would be important to have oral histories about this time period for people to think about how it affected them personally. Yeah. Oh, my therapist says we'll be talking about this for decades. Because anytime there's a unexpected or unintentional pause, we learn more about ourselves, right? Pause. And that for some was great, and for some was very challenging. And in that sense, I the work that I do in DEI and in the consulting, I said that when George Floyd happened in 2020, when we were having the pandemic, I don't know that it would have had the same presence and focus or catalyst that was if it wasn't that we were all sitting in front of a television. I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. It galvanized us and it's focused us in a way. And also it galvanized people about Juneteenth. Yes. There was a huge, increase. I read this in Traffic about the story about Juneteenth as a holiday. With George Floyd, people were thinking about, well, how did we get here? What is this all about? From slavery, and then how did slavery end? And then to Juneteenth. There's just such a pickup in this. People focused on things in ways that they wouldn't have if we had not had that pause. Yeah. In the reflection, from when I was a young child, I think probably for the same reason you have, my mother and my father were both very avid readers and
and they would talk a lot and make us talk a lot and have conversation. But one of the first times that I went to the South, other than Florida, is I went to North Carolina, and I took my daughter. And I've always had this connection to what the ancestors and the experience of enslaved people, and really kind of feeling like the energy. And so we went to a plantation, and I was like so upset that we missed a tour. I wanted to just kind of see, and I wanted her to understand what our experience in this country had been, and kind of see some of the things. And the man the man who was the caretaker, saw how upset I was, and he offered to take us out, just she and I. And I'll put this in the show notes so people can see what I'm talking about. But one of the things, and it sits with me still to this day, is he showed us these bricks. And the bricks had fingerprints in them, tiny fingerprints. And he had my daughter put her hand up to the fingerprints. And it was like, you cannot say anymore that we don't remember that these people and the experience of enslaved people has made this country what it is. And so the more that we remember, and yes, it is painful, right? And all the way around, it's the only way that we can really, I think, hope that we don't go backwards. And saying that now is not, with all the backlash in every way and all the erasure that's happening, it is even more important for us to remember what we have been through. And so history and historians like yourself are needed and necessary in this space. And so how would you like future historians and future folks to think of you and your legacy and what you have added to the American landscape in terms of your work?
Well, I hope that they would think that what I've done was useful, that it sparked conversation, that it sparked, other scholarship, that it's something. I mean, historians always get supplanted because you find new information, styles change, even the terminology changes, when you as time goes by. But I would want to be thought of as somebody who made a good faith effort to make the stories of African American people who were, nameless, or if not nameless, but were voiceless in many ways, to give them a voice in a way, to get people to think about them as people. I mean, the Hemingses of Monticello is an attempt to make those people, those Hemingses, live as individuals, because I think we understand stories and we understand history better through the lives of people. And you don't really get a chance to do that very much with enslaved people because we don't know that much about them. It just so happens that this family of people lived in a place that a lot of attention has been focused upon, but also were connected to a man who kept a lot of records. And they were able to, some of them were literate, so they were able to keep some of the records as well. And certainly the oral history of that family is something that's quite strong. So I'd like to be something who is useful, who added something to the conversation that would advance things and make things go forward, even from where I left it, then somebody else picks it up and goes forward.
I love that. Okay, so we've talked about your work. We talked about your impact. What about the fun stuff? What do you do for fun?
Well, I have a new dog, which you might hear in the background. At some point, she tends to howl at sirens as they come by, which is
all the time.
Living in Manhattan is an interesting concept. That's not something I knew was going to happen. But so playing with the dog is fun. About 6 months before the pandemic, about five months before the pandemic, I started taking piano lessons again.
Oh.
And I'd taken piano lessons from 5 to 11, and then I just stopped. I just stopped, and I rarely touched the piano in the following few years, and then after a certain point, never. So I found a teacher, and I've been taking piano lessons, and that is a lot of fun. It's humbling.
I bet.
It's humbling. He said, there's some things I can do. He said, you wouldn't have been able to do if you had not had, the lessons before. You wouldn't be able to do them so quickly, but because the muscle memory is to some degree there, but in ways it's not. So, you're not, I'm comfortable as a writer I'm comfortable, teaching, doing those kinds of things, but to go and do something where you're not so great at it
Yeah.
is it's humbling, and in that sense it's important because it really shows you who you are, the
Yeah.
kinds of things that matter to you, the kind of perfectionism that that's not always so great, because that can prevent you from taking risks and doing things. So that's fun. Going to movies with my family is fun as well. Yeah, those are the things that, and sometimes binge watching silly shows.
I love that you started taking piano lessons again because of exactly what you just said. My therapist, who I talk about all the time, everybody knows, she says that growth begins where comfort ends. And if we continuously aim to be in a space where we're a little bit uncomfortable, we're always growing. And oftentimes I think people feel like, okay, well, I'm this, amount of years old, or I've done all these things, so that's it. But I love hearing about continued growth, because I just think that that's what keeps us alive. Like literally, like doing additional things and learning.
Yes. And to take you out of your comfort zone. As it turns out, the music department at Harvard is about 5 minutes from my office, and they have practice rooms there. And so it's a humbling experience to go in there, because these are, there's students there, and these are the serious music majors, and you walk past the practice rooms, which are soundproof when you're in them, but you can kind of hear things. But you hear these young people who are there just doing all this stuff, and I'm, just going along with mine as well. And I wonder, it's like, what do they think about what I'm doing? Because it's not up to them, but it's, it puts you in your place in a way. It makes you. It is a growth experience, and that has been really meaningful to me to do it. I mean, I'm not going to become a concert pianist or anything like that, but to have a teacher, and it's so funny because when you get praise from a teacher, it's like you're 6 or 7 years old again, and that's such a weird situation to be in, but I appreciate it.
Well, I want an invitation to the recital. There's that. Okay, so I ask folks on my podcast the same 2 questions. I'm going to ask you them. One is this: it's your stand by your brand. What is one aspect of your personal brand that you will never compromise on?
Integrity.
Yeah. Yes. Love it. Okay, next one. Branding room only is a play on the term standing room only, because I think I'm clever. And so it really is, the question is, what is your magic? What is the thing about you that people would be in a room with only standing room only to experience or witness about you?
I think I can talk to people at whatever level I find them.
Yeah.
And I try to write in a way so that people who are, you can read from the way anybody at any level can understand what it is that I'm saying. And I try to speak that way as well.
Yeah.
And I think I present the same face to people. I don't dumb things down for people. And audiences appreciate that. My readers appreciate that. I've gotten letters from people, and people say to me that that's one thing that I feel like I'm talking to them and speaking directly to them. And I think that's important.
It absolutely is. I think of some professors that I had who were very much like, oh, I am professor. And there's that, because there's perspective, but it is also lovely to be able to be in conversation with someone and feel as if you're equally heard and being fairly treated in the interaction.
Because I want people to feel that they're part of it.
Yeah.
Because they are.
I have thoroughly enjoyed having this conversation with you. I thank you so much for spending some time with me in the branding room. We're going to put links to all of your books and anything else you want in the show notes. But if there's any way that you want folks to connect with you or to find out more about you, let us know. What's that?
Well, the books are the way to get to know me, particularly on Juneteenth, because that's my most personal thing. So what I write is how you know me, and that's in my books.
I love that. Well, thank you for being a guest on the show today. Everyone, go and tell everybody about this episode because they need to learn them some things. And it's important for us to hear about where we've been to figure out where we're going to go. So make sure you subscribe, you download, and you tell a friend. And I'll see you all next time. Branding Room. Bye.
Bye.
Wasn't that an amazing conversation? I learned so much. Even again, being in a space where I often will talk about the experience of Juneteenth and what it meant for us Americans, but hearing the preeminent scholar about Juneteenth to speak about her own personal experiences, as well as what we as a country and the world really should take away from the experience of enslaved people, particularly through that lens of Juneteenth, as a celebration as well as a commemoration of the experiences of African-American people in this country was really a truly special experience for me. And so I would love for you to share this with everybody, particularly in your workplaces and spaces, because we need to make sure that we don't forget history, because it's important for us to honor it in all of its challenges while we press forward into better spaces. We still got to look back in order to go forward. As always, I thank you for listening. Make sure you download, like, and share. And I'll see you next time in the Branding Room.